Welcome to the Easy Peasy Interaction Toolkit. I designed this kit to be a bit of a rocket booster for any immersive design project that needs to be prototyped. I'm intending this to be a bit of a replacement to doing paper prototypes. The idea here is to have something that's just as quick to create like a paper prototype, but with some of the versatility that's inherent in any digital prototype. And most importantly, there is no coding required for this prototype. I mean, you're free to add your code on top of it, but to get going with this, you don't need to be a programmer at all. So if you know how to use Photoshop, Microsoft Excel, or even PowerPoint, this should be just up your alley. Just some caveats at the beginning. This is for people that don't have headsets, but would like to have some kind of experience with designing 3D virtual environments. For those that do have headsets, I'll create another guide using some of the code from this toolkit, but headset oriented rather than screen oriented. Okay, let's get started. First thing to do is actually download the kit. I'll post the link in the description. You can also kind of glean it from the screen cap here, but I'll post the link in the description so you can just click it. Now, I'm assuming that you don't actually have GitHub and don't know how to use Git. So what we can do is we can just straight up download the zip file for the code. For people that already know how to use Git, I recommend actually cloning this project and doing a fork. But for newbies, what you need to do is you need to go onto the code button, expand the menu, and then go ahead and click that download zip button right there. Now, download it to somewhere that you know, because you're going to need to extract this zip file. This screen cap is coming from a Windows machine, but it should be a similar idea as your Mac or whatever else you're using. So let's go ahead and extract this zip file, and you can see that it's just a Unity project folder. So then what we need to do is we need to go into Unity Hub, open an existing project using the open button, and now we need to look for where we placed the extracted folder. Point Unity to the project folder, and then Unity will recognize it as a project. And then it's just going to start opening it. So it will take a while to open, although the file itself is very small. It has a lot of dependencies. So what we're going to do is we'll just work on a pre-opened version. Like, here's something I prepared earlier. While we're waiting for the project to load on your end, let's take a bit of a tour of the toolkit. Okay, so what do we have? We have three main scene examples where I've set up some pre-made scenes. You can find them in the Easy Peasy Interaction Toolkit folder, and then the example scenes folder. We can go through each scene by double-clicking each one, and then you'll see that every time we double-click one of the scenes, it will be loaded into our existing scene editor, and then you can also see it reflected in the hierarchy and the game view. So what we'll do now is we'll hover over the play button and click it. This is how we play the game, or actually interact with the environment as if we were the user. We need to concentrate our view in the game view. You might have noticed that my mouse has disappeared. That's because I clicked into the game view, and as we move our mouse, it seems like we're moving our head around. Now, we're not just limited to just moving our heads. We can also move around. So we can press the W, A, S, and D keys. So that's W, A, S, and D to be able to move around. Now you'll notice as we move around in the game view, the capsule in the scene view is also moving around. That capsule is representing us as the user. You'll also notice the buttons pop up a little bit. So essentially what we're seeing in the scene view is a different perspective to what we're seeing in the game view. It's a different perspective of the same simulation, of the same scene. Now, the way we interact with this virtual environment is by manipulating our view. And you'll notice that every time we hover over something we can interact with, the cursor changes into a clicky finger from just your normal crosshair. In this case, we're talking about a couple of buttons. Now, to interact with it, we simply click. Now, we've just chosen the box cycling activity in this branching choices example. And as you would expect, this activity is simply cycling between boxes. Now, this functionality might be useful for some kind of a selection menu. You just cycle through a bunch of different items. Now, if we press escape, we get our mouse cursor back. That way we can head back to the play button and then press it again so the scene stops. We go back into edit mode. Once we get back into edit mode, the scene resets to its saved state. So everything that we did is cancelled out, and essentially we've just restarted the level or the scene. Now what we can do is restart the simulation, restart the game, and select the other choice. In this case, it is pushing, and you can see that as soon as we select it, the objects that were previously invisible and deactivated get activated and they fall to the ground, and they're now available for us to push around. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's load the item cycling scene so we can have a closer look at how this works. Here we can see that if we press the next button, the next box gets activated. In the same way, if we press the previous button, it does the same thing but backwards. Okay, let's load the cascading menu example. What this scene is showing is just a cascading menu. You click one menu item, it opens up the next one. This time it's an item cycling rig like we saw before, but this time it has a toggle button. You can turn it on and off, but other than that, it functions just as you would expect. That's just a little buggy thing there. I'll fix that, don't worry. And that ends the quick tour of the kit. Now, those quick examples basically show you a lot of the functionality that you would have in a prototype. At least one that you can give to a user to test. And it has at least the same functionality and interactivity as what you would expect in a paper prototype. There is still a lot of imagination on the user's part to see how the final product would actually work, but there is enough in there for you to actually do some user testing. Okay, that project should have loaded in your computer by now. Let's start using the items in the toolkit to create our own new scenes. Now, in this particular demonstration, I have a folder here called My Custom Project. You can obviously call this anything you want, but in this example, it's My Custom Project. Inside this custom project folder, I have 3 folders: images, prefabs, and scenes. Let's go ahead and create a scene from scratch. So what we need to do is just right-click in the empty folder. If you're on Mac, I recommend getting a mouse with 2 buttons instead of 1. If you don't have that available, I think the right-click equivalent is holding Command or Control while you left-click. Either one of those, give that a try. Next, we need to find the Create option, and since it's a very common function, it's usually at the very top. The Create menu has everything you can create from scratch for your Unity assets, including scenes. If you wanted to create the scene this way, what you would do is you would just click the scene option and you would have a new scene. Now, if you preferred the Microsoft Word way of doing things, you can just go up to the File menu and then create a new scene from there. Let's choose the basic built-in scene as our template, and now we have an empty scene that we can play with. You'll notice that it is currently untitled, just as it would be if it was an untitled document in Microsoft Word. Now, just a warning, this is an unsaved scene, so that's why you don't see it in the Assets folder. If we want to keep this scene, we'll have to save it manually. But let's just go ahead and keep working on this unsaved untitled scene. Now, if we go back to the example scenes folder, we can see that they're saved, but we want to populate our empty scene right now. And what we can do is we can go to the Easy Peasy Toolkits prefabs folder. Let's choose the player type 0 variant and drag it into our scene. This is a prefabricated player object with all the correct configurations already put in. You don't have to do anything. I did it for you already. Now it's just a simple capsule. It doesn't have any shape, but since we'll be looking out from the inside of this capsule, it doesn't really matter, does it? Now looking around, you'll notice that this capsule is currently floating in space. So we'll need to give it something to stand on, and that's not too difficult. Let's go ahead and create a plane primitive for our player to stand on. Let's go ahead and scale this plane, this floor, so we don't fall off the edge really easily. Okay, let's see how this runs. Wait a minute. Didn't I say that we can't see the capsule because we're looking at it from the first person perspective? What's happening? Well, the template that we chose actually had a pre-installed camera already. You might have noticed that come in when we created the scene. But this is conflicting with the camera that's already been set up in the player type 0 prefab. So what we need to do is we just need to go ahead and delete that default camera, press play, and then we have our first person perspective again. Now we can see. So we did take this prefab from the toolkit. We're probably going to make changes to it sometime in the future, so it's good for us to make it our own. First step is to just go ahead and rename it, and then we can drag it into our prefabs folder, and let's make it a variant. Making it a variant means that it's still connected to its original prefab. Any changes that's made to the original prefab gets propagated down to our own version, so we get the benefit of all new updates. Anyway, let's go ahead and drag a new interactable object in our scene so we can actually do something. Let's take a closer look at how this object is actually made. You can see that it's actually made of several sub-objects. And let's say we wanted to change the text. What we can do is we just go into the text canvas, look for the game object that actually has the text component, and then update the text component. And this is the fundamental structure of Unity. Everything is a game object, and you can attach components to it to change its behavior. So if we take the example of the graphics object, instead of a text mesh pro component, you can see that we have a mesh renderer and a cube as the mesh. Another thing to notice about this setup is the graphics object is separate. So we have the easy peasy interactable root object up there. And then now we're looking at the graphics object. The reason for this is sometimes we might want to just modify the graphics object somehow. In this case, we're going to do a scale up and scale down, and we don't necessarily want to affect any of the other objects. You don't have to do it this way, but it just makes it easier to manage. If you were to scale any object, any of its children will also get those transformations. So maybe you don't want that. And in this case, I definitely don't want it. Okay, so now let's look at the interaction box. So this interactable general script is something that I wrote, and it has an event called onFirstInteract. It also has an event called onHoverEnter and onHoverExit. So what's happening right now is there is a laser or a raycast coming out from the camera, shooting itself into the screen. And when it hits this box collider of this interaction box, it triggers the interactable script that I have here. So when we first hit it, this onHoverEnter event gets triggered, and then it's running this script called pulse up, which makes it grow. And that's what I'm basically talking about when we transform a root object. It affects all the rest of its children. This pulse up operation is being run at the easy peasy interactable object level. So it affects the graphics object, the text object, and the interaction box itself even. Just keep this in mind for later because you can actually use these events for yourself. In fact, let's go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to move this whole object a little bit closer to the horizon so we don't have to look up so much to access it. Now let's get this button to do a trick. Let's make something disappear. Let's add our object that we're going to make disappear. Let's just go ahead and make it more prominent. And now we can add it to our onFirstInteract event. We just need to go ahead and press the plus icon. You will see there is now an empty slot for us to play with. And then we'll just go ahead and drag our subject into the object box. We now have access to all of this object's public functions. That means we can choose which function to call once this event is triggered. The function menu is structured according to which component is actually providing the public function. Now, if we wanted to make an object disappear, we go into the GameObject component, then use this function called setActive. Now, setActive has a true-false parameter or a Boolean parameter if you want to be proper. If it is unticked, what this will do is switch the active status of that object to false, which essentially makes it disappear from the scene. And that's it. You can construct fairly extensive prototypes just using this functionality of turning things on and off and calling functions when the user interacts with that prototype. Okay, this field is looking a bit barren, so let's add some grass to it. Let's go ahead and create a folder to contain the materials. Create the material, right-click on the folder, create material, rename the material to grass, change the color, and then drag it onto the plane. And you can see that if we adjust the color in the component, we also adjust the color in the screen. So it's just that continuation of the Unity paradigm. Adjust the component, adjust the behavior. So on that topic, our cube here is very boring. It's basically just default, except for the scaling that we did earlier. All it can really do right now is just disappear with our setup. We can only get it back by stopping the game and then restarting from the beginning. But we can add all sorts of behaviors to it to make it more interesting. And I have a bunch of scripts here that will make it more interesting. Let's make it disappear and reappear, you know, like a peekaboo kind of thing. And we can do that with the itemActiveToggle script here. Now let's go back to the interaction box and update the event. You can see that the list of available components has changed in our cube because we just added itemActiveToggle. You just need to scroll down to the toggle function. So what this will do now is every time this event gets triggered, it'll run the itemActiveToggle toggle function. And essentially what it does is just turns it off when it's on and turns it on if it's off. It's a toggle. So now we have some idea of how to use custom scripts, and notice that you didn't have to write any code. It was just drag and drop all the way through. Now it's time to save this scene. You'll see that there is an asterisk at the top of the untitled name. That means this scene has some changes and it hasn't actually been saved. And in fact, there's no version of it saved anywhere. So let's go save. Let's have a look at something more complicated. This kit has a few more scripts. Let's have a look at how the item cycling works. This one involves two buttons. If we're going to cycle through some objects, it might be good to have a previous and a next button. Taking a look at what this next button is doing, we can see that it's connected to this box cycler object, and it is calling the next item in the item cycler component. Now let's take a closer look at the item cycler. So it has a list of objects that it needs to cycle through, and these objects just happen to be children of the main object. The item cycler doesn't actually care where the objects are in terms of the hierarchy, but it's good practice to do it this way because it's less messy, easier to navigate. Okay, now let's see if we can replicate that in our own scene. I guess we'll be needing some objects to cycle through, so let's just go ahead and create those really quickly. Let's make it a bit different to the sample scene one. Let's just move this to the side so there's a clear left to right sequence. Make it a bit bigger so it's more prominent. And then let's go ahead and add another object here that's also unique and not the same as the others. And let's go ahead and position that so it's roughly going from left to right. Now we need to create the object that hosts the cycling script. It can be any of these existing ones already, but it's just easier to create a fresh one and then label it that way. So right now that cycler object is just an empty game object that's called cycler. Now we need to add the item cycler script to the object by dragging it over. So when we inspect the cycler object again, we can see that it has the item cycler component to it now. Now we need to tell it which objects it needs to cycle through. And the way to do that is just by dragging these objects onto the items list. Okay, now the cycler setup is ready to go. We just need to interact with it somehow. And the way to do that is, yes, you guessed it, we just use the interaction box. Now currently this is pointed to our peekaboo cube that just toggles on and off. We're going to need to update this with the new cycler object that we just made. So we just take the cycler object and then drag it over to the slot here. Then we need to go into the item cycler component that this object has and then call the next item function. And that's it, this button is ready to go. It can cycle through the item. So if we were to press play now, what is going to happen is every time we click the hello button, the onFirst interact event will get triggered, which we just told to go to the cycler object, which has the item cycler component that we've set up to cycle through these objects. Now, before we press play, let's just rearrange these objects really quickly and play. And just look at our handiwork. We're cycling through these objects. Fun. Okay, let's just do some tidying up before we finish. Let's go ahead and change the hello text into next, so our users see next. Then for our own benefit, let's rename the name of the object in the hierarchy to button next, so that makes much more sense. And let's duplicate this button so we can have one to cycle backwards. It's a relatively simple thing to do. All we need is to change the labels to the correct thing. In this case, it's going to be previous. Let's rearrange this so the buttons are next to each other in the hierarchy. And I guess let's optimize the positioning of them. And we have two buttons that say next, so we need to go ahead and update the text that the user sees. Okay, let's see what we've got. We're nearly done, I think. So our next button goes to the next object as expected. What does our previous button do? Oh no, it goes to the next item as well. The reason why this is happening is because, of course, we duplicated this previous button from the original next button. We need to do one last update, so it's actually a previous button. We need to go into its interaction box and merely update the function that it calls on the item cycler. Instead of next item, we use previous item. And let's see what happens. Well, that looks like it's working to me. This is a good place to end. Throughout this almost 25-minute video, you saw only dragging and dropping, no code. This is the easy peasy interaction toolkit designed for no code, quick, low fidelity prototyping for interactive 3D environments. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, write in the comments, post in the GitHub. Hopefully this is useful to you. Thanks for listening.